Hey everyone, Brendan Sander here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to this discussion topic for rock album masterpieces part 1. There will be a part 2 to this, so keep an eye out for that. But there's lots of great albums out there in the world. I mean, I alone own over 11,000 albums in my collection. And certain ones though do stand head and shoulders above all of the rest. So join me as I run through 10 such albums here as part of Rock Album Masterpieces Part 1. But before we jump into that, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by subscribing, you'll be able to stay up to date on really cool videos just like this with Rock Album Masterpieces Part 1. Remember, there will be a Part 2. So as part of this, we are going to kick off and run A through H in this video, and then in Part 2, we'll pick up and continue the rest of the alphabet. Obviously, anything could be part of this, and I'm sure your rock masterpieces are different than mine. I did try to steer clear of some of the really big ones that we might expect being in here. Case in point, for AC/DC, I chose not to go with Back in Black, although that is a rock masterpiece. I also chose not to go with Highway to Hell. Instead, I'm going with Powerage, 1978, their 5th studio album, and it was the first to feature bassist Cliff Williams. I love this album. I am a person who grew up with Brian Johnson era AC/DC, so I'm always going to love that one, more. But I do really love this. In terms of the Bon Scott era, I go back to Powerage more than any other, more than Highway to Hell. Now, whether or not that is because that album might be worn out a bit in terms of all those hits and everything that are on it, I'm not sure. But this one just has so many great tracks on it. The opening track, Rock and Roll Damnation, is just a powerhouse to kick off with. I love the second track on here, Down Payment Blues. Riff Raff and Sin City, a 1-2 punch there at tracks, I think 4 and 5 that are on here. But it just keeps going. It's a great album, start to finish. I think it's a great representation. And out of the Bon Scott era, if we move aside from Highway to Hell of his era, this one here is my favorite of it. I think it is an absolute rock masterpiece, start to finish, all killer, no filler. And that's going to kind of be the tone of this video, I think, the all killer, no filler, right? All right, next one up, Blue Oyster, called Fire of Unknown Origin, 1981 it was released. It's their 8th studio album, produced by Martin Birch, who worked with Whitesnake and Iron Maiden to give you a feel of what he had done. I mean, he's worked with so many different people, but it was great having him here on this album. It was the last album to feature the original lineup of the group, and I don't know if that's why, for me at least, things shifted after this, going into the 80s and stuff, but I love this album, and probably a big reason for it is the Billboard Top 40 hit, Burnin' For You. So good. I mean, I was drawn to this album immediately with that. I didn't grow up with this album. It's a little before my time. I came to it later. But it is my favorite Blue Oyster called album. Now, as I'm going to talk about on a lot of these are just huge, huge sellers. This one is not. It's probably actually the least selling of all the albums I'm going to talk about in here today, with only 500,000 copies sold in the US. But I love this album. This one just has so many great tracks on it. Of course, you get the second track on here that is Burnin' For You, but it's later tracks on here like Vengeance that I like, track 6, Joan Crawford, track 8, which I fell in love with immediately, that piano intro beginning bit to that thing. It's just great stuff all the way through. I never get tired of that album. I go back to it all the time. All right, next one, Boston, self-titled release, 1976, debut studio album. And as I said, some of these are going to be the huge, big sellers, going to be their most popular album. I can't deny this one here. I do like other Boston albums and stuff, but 17 million copies sold. I mean, it is one of the largest all-time selling debut albums, maybe second only behind Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. But this thing here, what always fascinated me about this album is that it was actually recorded as a demo. And he had presented it, Tom Schultz, the guitar player who recorded and mastered this thing, to the label. And they were like, oh, you need to record a proper album. And they sent him off with an engineer, and they realized they couldn't do it any better than the demo. So they ended up turning that back in just with it tweaked a little bit here and there. And then the label thought it was this great thing, even though it was actually the same original demo that he had turned in. But to me, that just shows the quality of this, and that layered recording style that Tom Schultz did for this thing, I think is amazing. Of course, it would get picked up later. Def Leppard would use it to great effect on Hysteria, which is another rock masterpiece, although I'm not including it here because it's just one of those mega ones we talk about all the time. So let's move on, though, to another one. The Cult, Sonic Temple, 1989, fourth studio album from these guys. This one here, they really embraced the full-on rock sound of the 80s. They had been moving slowly from the keyboard-laden synthesizer style stuff. Electric kind of became that first rock album, but this one here, in my opinion, is where they finally started firing on all cylinders. Last album to feature longtime bassist at the time, Jamie Stewart, and the album itself would go on to sell 1 million copies, and I think it's their biggest selling album in their catalog. And while maybe not one of the biggest all-time selling things, this one with its like the first 5 songs on this thing right out of the gate: Sun King, Firewoman, American Horse, Edie, Chow Baby, Sweet Soul Sister. I mean, it's just amazing. So it's one of those albums that you put on and it's just like hit after hit after hit. It keeps coming. But the rest of the album, the deep cuts that are on it, steals my heart every time as well. They could have easily been the hits had they been chosen as the singles for it. Instead, they are going with the ones they did. Now I've got one that is a newer, modern rock masterpiece in my opinion. No sales figures on this, but it probably isn't even hitting the 500,000 mark, and I'm not worrying about that because I love the album so much. Deep Purple, Now What, from 2013. No, I know I didn't go with Machine Head, which is a rock masterpiece. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the album I'm holding up is the only rock masterpiece by these artists. I'm just simply saying these are rock masterpieces. 19th studio album. It's produced by Bob Ezrin, who worked with Kiss, Pink Floyd, amongst others, Alice Cooper. I mean, who hasn't Bob Ezrin worked with? He's amazing. But he's come in recent years and been working with Deep Purple on their last 3 studio albums and just doing amazing things with the band. There's been this great resurgence. This is with Steve Morse in the lineup, so no, it's not Ritchie Blackmore, but I have to say, it's one of my favorite records, definitely my favorite of the newer era of the band since Steve Morse came in to play with them in around 95 or so. But this album here, I think, stands up to any of the earlier stuff as well. It's a different style stuff, but it stands up to it. It is an amazing album. All right, now we're going to jump way back into the 60s here with a rock masterpiece from The Doors, their self-titled release, 1967 debut studio album. Of course, none other than Jim Morrison as the frontman, but everyone that was in the band, The Doors, really deserves credit. I mean, we got Ray Manzarek on the keyboards. The Doors would not have sounded like them without him. And then you've got Robbie Krieger on the guitar, who brought his jazz stylings and stuff to it that was something different and unique, you know, that made the rock sound that they had different. And of course, he wrote Light My Fire off of here. So without that, they probably wouldn't have exploded. And then, of course, you've got John Dinsmore on drums. So all in all, amazing. And for years, I would have said LA Woman was my favorite album. But in recent years, I've been going back to this album more and more and more and seeing its magicalness of what it was, and the fact that in 1967, for what it was and how it stood out and the ground that it broke at that time, I definitely consider this one a rock masterpiece. All right, next one up. Fleetwood Mac, Tango in the Night, 1987. No, it's not Rumors or the self-titled one. I know those are big albums, but the one that I go back to over and over and over is this one, 14th studio album. It was the last to feature Lindsey Buckingham at the time until the reunion that came in 1997, a decade later, with The Dance, the live album that they did that had some new tracks and stuff like that. This would sell 3 million, and I know that Rumors in the earlier album, the self-titled one, sold even more. But I don't know, I like this one. When I listened to this one, the opening track, Big Love, I had heard that in a movie soundtrack. I think it was Elizabethtown, and it just caught my ear. I absolutely loved it. But Seven Wonders on here. And of course, I'm a child of the 80s. I grew up with the song Little Lies. And all in all, I think this is an amazing album that really shows Christine McVie, and I've always been a big fan of hers. Never thought she got enough love, and I think this is a great album that's representative of that. So I had to go with that one for this rock masterpiece. Okay, next one, Foreigner 4. So yes, back to the big albums here. 1981, fourth studio album, produced by none other than Robert John Mutt Lange. Yes, I had to get one of those on here because if I had put AC/DC's Back in Black, we would have had him there. If I had put Def Leppard's Hysteria, we would have had him there. This guy deserves all kinds of awards and medals and things for the amazing albums he's produced. But all in all, I'm going with Foreigner 4 here. Amazing album. At the time, it held the #1 spot on the Billboard 200 album chart for 10 weeks. It became Atlantic Records' biggest selling album at the time. It sold 6 million copies in the US. But again, it's one of those albums that while it has huge hits like Jukebox Hero on here, Waiting for a Girl Like You, Urgent, it's actually the rest of the songs on here that when I finally got away from the greatest hits, like as a kid growing up, I had the greatest hits album records. And I knew the singles from that. But when I finally bought the album and I listened to all 10 of the tracks, and it opens with Nightlife, and then track 5, Luann, there's some really great tunes on here that are equally as good as those big hits. And I totally understand why this album spent 10 weeks at #1, has sold 6 million copies. It's not just because of the hits, it's because it's this great album. It is a rock masterpiece all, in and of itself. Okay, and I mentioned this band early on, and you can't have a rock masterpiece, review without this band in here. Plus, I actually think this is the greatest all-time rock record ever. I know that's a big statement, but that is my selection at least. Guns N' Roses, Appetite for Destruction, 1987, their debut studio album. 18 million copies sold. So that's where I was saying that it outdid Boston's self-titled at 17 million. I think this holds the record for largest debut selling album. But yeah, I honestly do think this is the greatest rock album. I do think that it outdoes Led Zeppelin 4 and some of those other great artists and stuff like that. But as I said, I have to preference this with, I am a child of the 80s. I grew up in the 80s. If I grew up in the 70s, I might be saying Led Zeppelin. Or if I grew up in the 60s, I might be saying another artist or something, right? So it all comes down to the era that you grew up in and so forth. And I came up with Guns N' Roses. I love this album. I've not gotten sick of it in its, 36-year history now that the album has been around and so forth. So I'm still going to go with it. I'm still going to include it in here because the way that the songs have multiple songs and structures in them and changes, and songs can go from being melodic pieces to hard and heavy pieces and so forth, and the different vocal range of Axl and all of that sort of stuff in here. It's just one of those albums that is a true, in my opinion, true rock masterpiece from start to finish on it. All right, and the last one that we're going to cover here, letter H, Heart, self-titled release from 1985, their 8th studio album. And I know a lot of you guys would probably want Dog and Butterfly in here, and I do love from, actually I think it's 1980, but BB Lestrange is another great one. This is that album that for me at least, start to finish, is phenomenal. Opening track, If Looks Could Kill, that song just gets it going every time. And after I've heard that one, it's a great driving album too, in my opinion. But I just have to leave the album on after that. And even though the band itself only wrote 4 of the songs that are on here, they brought in a lot of outside writers for that. And I know that for a lot of you, that would take it away from being such a great album, because it's not really an album by the band. It's got these outside writers and stuff. They brought an amazing amount of energy and character and stuff. And when you got Ann Wilson singing on these things, it just puts it over the top. So she sings like nobody else can. And I love the power and emotion and everything in this one here. And it just was that transition that the band was making into the more mainstream rock that shot them off, you know, from having been huge in the 70s to where they ultimately went in the 80s. Ultimately, 5 million copies were sold of this album. Again, in my opinion, making it a true rock masterpiece. So there you go, 10 rock album masterpieces. This was part 1. Remember, there's going to be a part 2 to this. Do check back and keep an eye out for that. I'll probably post in a day or two. But hopefully you enjoyed this of letters A through H. If there's one that you want to lob in here as a rock masterpiece, I'm sure you've got your own opinions on it, and that's cool. Do check back for part 2 of this, where I'm going to be picking up and continuing with the alphabet all the way through letter Z, and we'll see what that has to hold and in store for us. All right, everyone, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.